Welcome back to the Edible Valley Podcast. Today we're coming to you from Radio Row in New Orleans for Super Bowl 59. We've got a special guest today, Mark Bologna from the Beyond Bourbon Street podcast. We're diving into all things New Orleans, from the legendary food scene to the art of podcasting and, of course, our predictions for the big game. Stick around for this unforgettable conversation from the heart of the Big Easy. Welcome to the Edible Valley Podcast.
We want to invite you as we embark on a culinary journey through the heart of Vancouver Island.
From the fertile fields
to the pristine waters of the Pacific Ocean.
We'll explore the stories behind the food that nourishes us.
Tune in to each episode as we deep dive into the flavors, the traditions, and the innovations that make this a true paradise.
Now please join us as we explore our Edible Valley.
So we are here today with a very special guest. We are in New Orleans, Louisiana for Super Bowl. And specifically, we are on Radio Row with Mark Bologna of the Beyond Bourbon podcast. Right, there was a little bit of a tongue twister. And we're very fortunate and very lucky to have Mark here today. We have been researching a lot about New Orleans, and that is the very first thing that comes up a lot when you hit Google. New Orleans food is your podcast. So that might be a really good way to start, is know your roots in New Orleans and Louisiana run really deep.
They do.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about, I know you have some restaurant history as well.
Yeah.
And I want to add in too about this is that I have a group of culinary students that I'm challenging them in about 2 weeks once I get back to do a whole New Orleans style meal plan for there. So maybe if you can give them a few hits and tips in there, that might be helpful too.
All right. So a good place to start might be a bit about your background and how the combination of podcasting and the restaurant industry came together.
Yeah, sure. So I was born and raised here in the city, about 5 miles from where we're sitting. I grew up here. My family owned a little neighborhood restaurant called Teddy's Grill. So it was a po' boy place. So in New Orleans, a po' boy is a pretty famous, it's the bread, right? It's a pretty famous sandwich. And back then, certainly, there were neighborhood restaurants all over the place. And so you would walk in and get a cheap plate lunch or a po' boy, like a roast beef, maybe in gravy, or a French fry po' boy was the original po' boy. And so I grew up in that business. My parents owned it for 36 years. And I started working there when I was 11, which was a long time ago. And they had it up until Hurricane Katrina. So Katrina destroyed it. But we grew up with it, and we had a great time. I moved away from my day job and I came back. I'm the father of now 13-year-old twin daughters. So we moved back when they were infants to raise them here, but we lived all over the country. And we came back and I was looking for something to do on the side. And I got really aggravated with the description of New Orleans being Mardi Gras on Bourbon Street.
Right.
They show it on the world news every year, right? And there are women lifting up their shirts and exposing their breasts and throwing beads and all that. And I knew Mardi Gras is a very family-friendly, fun thing to do. And I knew New Orleans is a family place. I grew up in the heart of the city. When we came back, we chose to raise our kids in the city, about 3 miles from here. And so pretty quickly, this idea came to me. And this was about 10 years ago. So podcasting was taking off, but not where it is
just in its infancy. Yeah.
And I kept thinking about how do I portray the city? And a good friend actually came up with the idea of Beyond Bourbon Street, because it instantly conveys that there's more to the city than just Bourbon Street. And so we've been lucky enough. We just started our 10th year.
That's incredible. And I was looking back at some of your episodes, and the way that you describe it is beyond the food. It's the people, the music, the culture. Doing the research for your podcast and getting the interviews, has there ever been, or is there one that really comes to mind that maybe you thought, with your knowledge and background and history of the city, the podcast might go one way, but then it went a completely different way?
Sure. It happens more often than I expected. I should after 10 years, right? I should be used to it. But it happens pretty frequently. A couple of them, but one of them I interviewed, there's a local author named Richard Campanella. He's also a professor at Tulane University. And there was a big controversy here several years ago, like there was in a lot of the United States, about taking down statues. And I stay away from politics, so I didn't want to get into that, but it was gnawing at me. People had asked to do something about that. And then I discovered that Richard had written a book about Abraham Lincoln visiting New Orleans as a young man. He made 2 trips here. And that was really interesting to me. He visited slave markets when he was here. He stopped and sold goods at plantations along the way on the Mississippi River on the way down to New Orleans. He would have wandered around and seen slavery. And so it really hit me that those voyages, he was about 18, once he was about 22 or 23, really struck me that would have influenced him and his future thoughts on slavery and the country. And so that was really a different thing for me. And then just a second one, if I could, there's a tradition here in New Orleans called masking Indians, right?
Yes.
So they used to be called Mardi Gras Indians, but these are people from African-American culture here in the community that mask as Indians. And they do that in part to pay tribute to Native American Indians who would have helped them as they tried to escape from slavery. But the culture I'm used to seeing them on Mardi Gras Day, and they parade also a couple times a year. But when just this last summer, I sat down with a man named Shaka Zulu and talked to him, and I was really blown away by how much he does in terms of he goes to Africa and learns beading there. He interacts with people there. He's used some of the proceeds from his business to help with schools and things like that. So it's just a couple examples, but all the time, and maybe you guys experience this with your podcast, right? You think it's going to go one direction, and then no matter how much research you've done, it goes in another. And that's part of the fun of discovering, in my case, my city. Yeah, I've gotten to see it through just so many different eyes.
I was wondering, and we can switch more to food after this, but my last kind of question more about the podcast is, in a way, and I know even reading some of the reviews on Apple Podcasts of people who've listened to your podcast say, this is my first time down in New Orleans. It's like a resource guide. It's like a tourist book. Did you ever imagine looking at your own city through kind of an outsider's lens? Is that how you would call it, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I do a mix of history and things to do.
Right.
And that's intentional. And I have two guiding principles for me. One, I'm constantly thinking about the person that's not here or not from here that wants to visit. And the second thing is my mom is about a 7th generation New Orleanian. And I try to put something in every episode that she will be surprised about. So there's something for locals and something for people that aren't from here.
That's amazing. I love that. And that's why I started my podcast. And it was just literally to reach out to the people in my community and find out their story, right? Like, and
it's so interesting.
It is.
Every community has so many people that just have this knowledge, like wherever you're from.
Yeah, and it's like even the smallest little thing in that community can change it in such a huge way. So
yeah. With business owners, artisans, culture bearers, whatever it might be, I find. And again, I grew up in the city, and I've now done this for almost 10 years, 220-something episodes, and I'm still continually surprised at how much I learn, even on the topics you think you know, right? It's still somebody's perspective opens up your eyes in a different way.
Of course.
And I think that's one of the joys of podcasting. I know we're floating our own boat here for a moment, but you mentioned about some of the Native Americans, especially here in New Orleans, as I know from where we are in Canada, a lot of traditions are passed along orally, and there's such a deep tradition in oral storytelling. And I always think about podcasting as a way of oral storytelling in that context. And I think that's really neat. And I think we've got this historical record, especially something like what your podcast does, to have that record of New Orleans, past and present. And it's just a neat thing to have.
Yeah, I think of it like now we all carry cameras in our pockets, and you take thousands of pictures. But what we don't have is the audio. So in my podcast, I've interviewed both my father and my mother for really selfish reasons, although they were well received with the community. But I wanted to be able to capture the audio, right? And I think about that with the podcast, that somebody will discover your show years from now or discover my show years from now. My kids someday will listen to the show and have hundreds of hours of their dad's voice. And we're inundated with pictures today, but audio is still a little bit more precious to me, right? Captures that moment where you get somebody really reacting and excited about their story, whether it's their business or their cooking or whatever it might be. And I think that's one of the really neat things about podcasting.
Very much. No.
Okay, now you got me charged up about food.
Great, let's go.
I don't even know where to start because I've been picking into this for the longest part of my career, because I always there's a connection between Canada and New Orleans with the Canadian aspect of it. So I love the tradition of how the food is developed down here to how it's using some of the classic French styles from up in northern Canada, I guess. And so it's just so beautiful to see. But I think you guys have developed it, and there is like some iconic dishes. Are there some iconic dishes you would like to tell us about?
So, and one of the things we were talking about just before we came on air is you've challenged your students, I think, right? To put together a menu. I think a gumbo is a great way to do that. A chicken and andouille sausage gumbo. So you can find those ingredients anywhere. You can find a good smoked sausage and a good fresh chicken, right?
Yeah.
So many things here in Louisiana start with a roux. And so a good gumbo starts with a roux in most cases. We're catching background. Nobody's experiencing the NFL experience.
We are definitely doing the NFL.
But I think a gumbo encapsulates so many cultures as well. It has a strong not Canadian influence, but a strong Caribbean influence. Has a strong African influence. People here in New Orleans have made it their own over generations. But a great gumbo, chicken and andouille is my favorite. But they also make a seafood gumbo here, which is very popular with crabs and shrimp and sometimes crawfish in it.
I would be all over that.
I think that's a good one. I think another one, and what I like about a gumbo is you can make it anywhere. Well, certainly we have local sausage makers and things like that. That's a dish you could take home and your students could prepare.
Oh, easy enough. And especially being on the West Coast.
Yes.
We have all those same ingredients that we could.
Right.
We just make it our own, right?
Right.
A few salmon in there, a little Dungeness crab, and
right.
we're
You
coming
can make
very
a seafood
close.
gumbo, right? Yeah. And make it your own with your own spin on it, right? Another one is jambalaya, which is a rice-based dish, right? A little bit of tomato in it sometimes. Again, typically has chicken and sausage. That one's harder to find on menus because it's mostly something your mom would cook at home.
I have a story about gumbo. As we used to do the Swan Fest, where we get one of the local farmers would bring all his hot peppers to us. And we could only use like 3 or 4 of them on the big buffet, and so then we'd be stuck with them. So then it was always the challenge that the chefs would cook each other jambalaya, but then they'd see how hot they could make it, and it was like to the point of tears coming down your face.
It's one of those dishes here. It was a rustic dish, so it shouldn't be a catch-all. You'd throw whatever you had in it. So when I grew up, because we had a restaurant and one of the things we served were ham po' boys, our mom always put ham in it in addition to sausage because that's what we had. You put whatever vegetables you have into it. Typically it has like green bell peppers and onions and garlic in it, but you put whatever you have. And so that's a good catch-all dish as well. Another one is a good étouffée. So a tomato-based dish, again, served over rice. Typically, you would get like a shrimp étouffée or a crawfish étouffée. So again, that has big chunky tomatoes in it, big chunky pieces of vegetables in it, and some protein served over a bed of rice. So that's another one that you could also probably adapt in Canada. And gosh, I could go on, but those are 3 that come to mind that I think, I know you guys just got in town, but if you have the opportunity to get any of those, you should definitely do that.
It's on our agenda. So. There's a couple other things I know Erin's.
Oh, I have a craving, and I've been having this for quite some time for a really good beignet. And I know there's a couple of classic places in New Orleans, but are there any recommendations that you have, maybe off the beaten path or varieties of those?
So the big one, of course, is called Café du Monde.
Right.
It's open 24 hours a day. It's a great place to get beignets. Jameis Winston was just there doing his own broadcasting for the Super Bowl. But right around the corner on Royal Street is a place called Café Beignet. And they make really good beignets. It's probably 4 or 5 blocks from Café du Monde. It's smaller. It doesn't attract the crowds. And there are several locations of Café Beignet, but they make a really great beignet as well. And beignets are cheap. They're fattening, but they're cheap. And so it's fun if you have the time to stop by maybe in a couple places and have them. Café Beignet is the place I like to recommend.
Good to know. That's a good to know. Be on the list.
So not just one place. We've got a couple.
Right. And just kind of stepping back and looking at the food culture of New Orleans as a whole, maybe for even the 10 years that you've been doing the podcast, has there been any changes or major shifts, or even since Katrina, that you've noticed in food culture, particularly in New Orleans?
That's a great question. And the answer is a definitive yes.
Okay.
So the dishes that we're talking about and growing up with po' boys, all very common at almost any restaurant in the city, certainly any native non-chain restaurant. On Mondays, you're going to find red beans and rice. That is just the dish. And that goes back to the days of Monday was clothes washing day. So mom would put a big pot of red beans, and like the generic mom, right? Not necessarily my mom, would put a pot of red beans on and let it cook all day and simmer on the stove while she was washing the clothes for the family. So any fresh, and that's a good indicator of if you're in a local restaurant or not. If red beans is served on Monday, then you're in the right spot. But I think New Orleans was fairly insular before Katrina. And one of the biggest changes that I've seen in the years since Katrina, and now we're coming up on 20 years, has been the Central American influence. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with after the storm, all those migrants came and helped rebuild the city. So you had all these people craving their own food, right? And New Orleans, if you think about it, has always been a melting pot, whether it was forced through slavery or it was through colonization or immigration. We've had these big populations come in and each make their own contributions to the cuisine, but definitely the Central American. So you couldn't find Honduran food in the city before Katrina. Now there's a wonderful place called Alma Cafe, ALMA. But there are plenty of examples like that where we have much more. We have authentic Mexican food here. We have, again, several countries from the Central American region that are represented. See lots of food trucks serving, again, people that came to help rebuild the city and were looking for a taste of their own country. Some stayed, other people came and put their own influences. So that's probably the biggest. And that's had a pretty profound impact. There really wasn't that kind of part of our culture here before Katrina.
And for you bringing this full circle with your podcast, where do you see it growing? Like you had mentioned that you think you've reached all the stories or you know the culture, you know the city, and then you realize you really don't. So where do you see your podcast going? Do you have a goal in mind or just keep growing as much as possible?
When I started it, maybe like you guys, I didn't know if anybody would listen, right? Other than my mom. I knew my mom would listen.
I still say my mom listens. I don't know if that happens half the time.
My mom does. She usually texts me a critique after the show. Right?
That's excellent.
So if I've done anything wrong, my mom will point it out or she'll say that's really interesting or whatever it was. But people have listened, just like your show. And at this point, it's been downloaded, getting close to 2 million times, separate episodes. So that's staggering to me when you think about being in that many people's ears over that much time.
Yes.
For me, it's now all the low-hanging fruit is gone, right? All the easy episodes are gone. How to pronounce things in New Orleans. We've done that.
Right.
Kind of first-time visitors. We've done that. We've done saints. We've done all the kind of low-hanging fruit. So it has gotten harder, I find, to find the stories. But as you mentioned, John, earlier, there's still an unlimited amount of individuals with their own stories. And new stories are being written all the time, whether it's a new business owner. We did one on a place called Porgy's Seafood Market. It's 2 chefs that got really interested in what they call bycatch. So the things are being caught beyond the typical. Here in Louisiana, we catch a lot of speckled trout, we catch a lot of redfish, we catch a lot of drum. But of course, professional commercial fishermen are catching other things and didn't have a market for those things. So Porgy's decided to create a market for that. So you can go in and you can buy fresh fish out of their counter, or they will prepare any of those fish for you to show you how to do it, to try to encourage a market for that.
Oh, that gets me so excited. And I love hearing stuff. I love when people teach people how to cook and how to use like underused items, right?
Right.
And it's so funny because I always find underused items become all of a sudden premier.
Sure.
If you
Just give it a few years and
you go back in New Orleans history, black and redfish was never a thing until Chef Paul Prudhomme brought it from the country into New Orleans. And then he created a shortage of redfish because it became so popular that we had to put limits on the amount of redfish you could catch. And that was a dish that before Paul Prudhomme was on no one's radar. It was an afterthought. Yeah. So it's stories like that, I think, that I keep looking for the more interesting. There was a leprosy colony in Louisiana about an hour from here. I had no idea. I had never heard of that. Recently learned about it. So I'm going to go out there and see. They have a museum there and they still maintain the grounds as a museum. So I'm going to do that. So I think it's more just continuing to dig in and look for those kind of really unique stories. And again, I try to balance things to do along with history. So I'm always looking for new museums or new opportunities, new authors that have written about various takes on the city. So people ask me all the time, maybe they ask you, will you run out? And I think that the topics have gotten a little bit difficult, but I can't imagine ever running out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think everybody always has a story to tell.
Yeah,
exactly. So let's get on to the big thing since we're here. Super Bowl. How are you feeling about this right now?
Today, because today is the 15th anniversary of the Saints beating the Indianapolis Colts in the Super Bowl down in Miami. See, today was, as I was walking here, I was very excited to think about that day. I was there with my brother, got to see that. But I think in terms of hosting, it's been about 8 years since New Orleans hosted a Super Bowl. Right. That was the Super Bowl between the Ravens and the 49ers. Unfortunately, in that one, power got cut to the Superdome.
Right.
The game was delayed for half an hour. So we're certainly hoping for better outcomes this time.
Crossing our fingers for
I think it's amazing, right? You have the Chiefs who've been now in 4 out of 5 Super Bowls. You have the Eagles who've been in the Super Bowl a couple of years ago against the Chiefs. 2 really stacked teams. You have all of the celebrities that come in with this. You have the Taylor Swift angle, which my 2 daughters are super excited about. Taylor Swift just performed in the Dome a few months ago, so she'll be back, I'm sure, to root on Travis.
I'm pretty sure that's what our pilot said when we flew in today.
Yeah, that's right.
I hope everyone enjoys it or is coming in for the Taylor Swift concert.
So I think it's a great matchup. 2 pretty evenly matched teams that can see it, right? Sure. You wonder now if the addition of Saquon Barkley to the Eagles, how much that they didn't have that obviously last time. So now you add that along with Jalen Hurts being a little bit more experienced. I think the Chiefs are in for a little bit tougher. And of course, it was a 3-point game last time they played.
It absolutely was. And it certainly isn't Patrick Mahomes' best year, let's say, but he does have a little bit of that magic. No matter how he plays.
They've looked a little bit more mortal, but
exactly.
But how much time does Patrick Mahomes need? Right?
100%.
A minute? 50 seconds? Yeah. So I'm hoping for a good, tight game. Since my Saints aren't in it, I just want to see an entertaining, hopefully high-scoring game.
Any prediction?
If I had to bet, I would bet on Philadelphia. I think they're going to pull it out. Dear, that's gonna aggravate my friends that are Chiefs fans. But I think maybe so. What do you guys think?
Well, I've been saying that I've been cheering for the Chiefs, and the only reason is every time I cheer for a team in the NFL or the CFL, they lose.
So we're doing reverse.
Yeah, a little reverse on this. Even though it was super exciting last year to watch them in Las Vegas. And it was one of those games I remember texting you and just being, I'm like, I think it was one of the last plays there. And I'm like, so the 49ers just lost, right?
Yeah. I think it's going to be great. Like I likewise, I think I'm cheering definitely for Philadelphia. But if Kansas City does end up winning, it would be neat to say that you could witness history.
Absolutely.
So I think either way, it's going to be a good game.
It should be a great game.
Absolutely.
Two teams certainly deserving to be here. Both had dominant performances, particularly Philadelphia with their long winning streak. I'm just really curious to see the addition of Saquon Barkley and what the Chiefs can or can't do with that addition. Yeah. He's had such a fine year. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to it.
Moments away. So.
Well, that's great. Thank you again, Mark. Really appreciate your time and collaborating on podcasts has always been a really big highlight for us. So thank you so much and really look forward to looking to see how this weekend goes and trying some delicious New Orleans food.
Yeah, and we're super excited to explore your city here and get to see all the great spots here.
You got great weather for it.
It looks like it. And yeah, I feel like we're going to come back, even though I've only been here a few hours so far.
We're already investing.
So apparently that New Orleans, like the humidity, it seeps into your pores. Once it gets in, you can't get it out.
That was the first thing we said when we stepped out of the airport this morning. Boy, you didn't realize it's that humid.
Yeah. I think yesterday we broke a new high. So we're in the upper 70s, low 80s. It doesn't get super cold here, although it did 2 weeks ago. We had a snowstorm.
I know.
The first snowstorm in decades. But now it feels like summer all of a sudden.
It does.
So absolutely. It's warm here. I saw people walking around in shorts. But I hope you get out to enjoy it. And I appreciate it. I just want to say thank you to the two of you for inviting me onto your show. I'm super excited about that. Super excited always to connect with other podcasters and maybe to help make your visit here a little bit more enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
That's a wrap from Radio Row in New Orleans. Huge thanks to Mark Bologna for sharing his insight in New Orleans, food, and podcasting. If you're a fan of the city, be sure to check out his podcast at Beyond Bourbon Street. Don't forget to subscribe to the Edible Valley podcast for more great conversations and let us know how you felt about Super Bowl 59. Catch you next time.